I remember when the country still felt whole. The roads were dusty but steady, stretching from New England farms to the quiet hills of Tennessee. Trains had begun to hum across the land, and steamboats drifted down the Mississippi like floating lanterns. There was noise, yes, debates, arguments. But beneath it all, there was still the sense that we were one people bound by something larger than difference. In the towns, life moved at the pace of the seasons. Spring meant planting. Autumn meant harvest. Sundays meant church. People worked the land, mended their fences, raised children, and read the papers by firelight. In the North, factories buzzed and cities climbed higher. In the South, cotton ruled like a quiet king, stretching white across the fields. Slavery existed, everyone knew, and though some turned away from it, discomforted, ashamed, uncertain, most did not speak of it out loud. Not yet. Not at dinner. Not in polite conversation. But something was shifting. The lines weren't drawn on maps yet, but you could feel them in the way letters were written, in the way a Northern senator paused before shaking a Southern hand, in the way a preacher's sermon could ignite silence or applause, depending on what he dared to say. We were not at war, but we were not at peace either. Somewhere in the heart of the country, something had begun to crack. And though no one could say exactly when, we were already walking toward it. Not running, not marching. Just walking slowly, steadily into the storm we did not yet dare to name. A country splintering. It's easy to look back and see the fracture clearly. Lines drawn across maps, states falling away like leaves in wind. But at the time, the break came slowly, like a long-held breath, turning into a sigh that could not be stopped. For decades, the country had argued with itself about tariffs and trade, about westward expansion, about how many stars could hang from the same flag before it tore at the seams. But beneath all of it, always was slavery. The South said it was a way of life, an economy, a tradition. The North said it was a stain, a moral rot. And in between were those who tried to hold the center, to believe both sides might somehow endure each other. But the center was eroding. In 1850, Congress tried to patch the divide with compromise new laws, to balance power, to calm tempers. But the Fugitive Slave Act, part of that same compromise, allowed slave catchers to roam northern streets, pulling people from homes, from freedom, from their very names. Even those who had once turned away could no longer claim ignorance. Tensions grew sharper. Books were written, pamphlets printed. Debates thundered through the halls of Congress and spilled into the streets. In Kansas, the argument turned. Violent pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought with rifles and fire. They called it Bleeding Kansas. It was a preview of things to come. And then came John Brown, a man with wild eyes and a voice like thunder. To some, a madman, to others, a prophet. In 1859, he led a raid on a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He hoped to arm the enslaved, to spark a revolt that would burn slavery to the ground. He failed. He was captured, and he was hanged. But before the rope tightened, he spoke words that chilled the nation. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. The South trembled at the thought. The North listened in silence. And somewhere between fear and awe, the country took a step closer to the edge. Then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, tall, quiet, cautious, won without carrying a single Southern state. To the South, it was the final insult. Proof that their voice no longer mattered, that the country was slipping from their grasp. South Carolina seceded first, then Mississippi, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. One by one, The stars began to fall from the banner. They said they were defending their rights. They said they were protecting their way of life. But at the heart of it was slavery, and the fear that it would end. By the spring of 1861, 2 flags flew over American soil. 2 governments, 2 versions of what the future should be. And for all the talk, all the papers, all the speeches and deals, there was no more room for compromise. The storm had arrived, and it would not pass quietly. Election and secession. The year was 1860, and the country felt like a house built on a fault line, beautiful, proud, and quietly trembling. The presidential election that year did not feel like just another contest. It felt like a test, not just of candidates or parties, but of the nation itself, whether it could still hold together, or whether it would finally split apart along the seams that had stretched so thin for so long. Abraham Lincoln was not a flashy man. He was tall, awkward, his clothes always a little wrinkled, his voice plain. But there was something in his eyes, steady, serious. He spoke carefully, as if each word mattered more than it seemed. He did not call for war. He did not call for abolition overnight. But he believed slavery was wrong, and he believed it must not spread any further. And for some, that was too much. When Lincoln won, without a single electoral vote from the Deep South, the message was clear: the South no longer had a path through the ballot box. Their vision of America, they felt, had been rejected by the rest of the country. And so, they began to leave. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. In the weeks that followed, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They did not walk away in anger. They walked away in solemn purpose, declaring their intent to build something new, something they called the Confederate States of America. They wrote their own Constitution, elected Jefferson Davis as their president, raised their own flag, and waited to see if the North would let them go in peace. Lincoln had not yet taken office. James Buchanan, the sitting president, did little to stop the unraveling. He believed he had no authority to stop the states from leaving, but he also believed they had no right to leave. So he waited, and the country held its breath. Lincoln arrived in Washington under threat of assassination. His train had slipped through Baltimore in the night windows, dark guards alert. He took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, standing beneath a half-built Capitol dome, unfinished, like the nation itself. In his inaugural address, he chose his words with care. He told the South he had no intention of interfering with slavery, where it already existed. He pleaded for unity. He said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But friendship was no longer enough. In Charleston Harbor, a lonely island fort called Sumter, flew the Union flag. Confederate forces surrounded it, demanding its surrender. Washington refused, and there, on a mild April morning, the waiting ended. The Confederates opened fire. For 34 hours, the cannons thundered across the water. Smoke filled the sky. The American flag was lowered from the fort. No one died in the battle. But something else died that day. The illusion that this could be resolved without war, that a nation could tear in two and still somehow hold. That reason alone could mend what history had broken. In the North, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. In the South, 4 more states joined the Confederacy. And the country, once uncertain, was now 2 armies facing one another. Brother against brother. Flag against flag. The time for speeches had passed. The war had begun. Fort Sumter and the first shots. It began, not with a battle cry, but with a flare in the sky, an orange arc rising slowly over Charleston Harbor, breaking the quiet of early morning on April 12, 1861. The shell arced toward Fort Sumter, where Union Major Robert Anderson and his men had been waiting for weeks, hungry and surrounded, but unmoved. They had flown the stars and stripes over the small brick fortress, even as Confederate forces tightened their hold around them, even as supplies dwindled and options vanished. That single flare signaled the end of waiting. The war had arrived. Cannons thundered from the shore. The fort shook with every strike, brick shattered, timbers burned. Inside, the Union soldiers held their fire at first. They had no real hope of victory. Their supplies were too low, their powder nearly gone. But pride has its own momentum. They returned fire, their shots echoing back across the harbor. Charleston watched from rooftops and porches. Some cheered, some prayed. All knew they were witnessing a beginning that could not be undone. For 34 hours, the bombardment continued. No soldiers were killed in the exchange, a strange, almost gentle entry into what would become the bloodiest conflict in American history. But make no mistake, it was war. On April 13th, Major Anderson surrendered the fort. He marched his men out with dignity, carrying their flag with them. The Confederates raised their own in its place, a new banner, over the same stones, a symbol of a country trying to be born. And in the North, something snapped. Until that moment, many in the Union had hoped the crisis might pass, that cooler heads might prevail, that the Southern states might reconsider, or that the Union might learn to live with the fracture. But when Fort Sumter fell, the illusion of compromise crumbled with it. Crowds gathered in the streets of northern cities. Church bells rang. Young men rushed to enlist some singing as they queued in long lines outside recruiting stations. Flags flew from windows. The country was awake now, wide-eyed and bracing. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. He did not call it a war, just an effort to preserve the Union. But the word was no longer his to avoid. In the South, the call to arms echoed just as fiercely. Virginia seceded, then Arkansas, then North Carolina, then Tennessee. Border states hesitated, torn between geography and allegiance. Families split. Communities whispered. The center could no longer hold. Suddenly, the map was not just lines and colors, it was lives. And every line drawn divided more than territory. It divided memory, loyalty, home. Railroads began to rumble with troops. Factories shifted to make rifles instead of tools. Farms prepared for the harvest, but not of wheat. Neither side expected a long war. The North believed the South would fold quickly under pressure. The South believed the North lacked the stomach for real fight. They were both wrong. But for now, in that first rush of fire and flags, in that rush of uniforms and songs, there was still a sense of something noble, something necessary, something almost clean. That too would change. But in the early spring of 1861, as the smoke cleared over Charleston Harbor and the last Union boat slipped away from Fort Sumter's ruined walls, the country stood on the edge of something vast and terrible. And it had already begun. Brother against brother. There are wars between nations, and then there are wars that tear through the same family photo. The American Civil War was both. By the summer of 1861, the lines were drawn not just across maps but across kitchen tables. States divided, towns split, and sometimes even worse, families chose opposite sides. A brother in gray, a brother in blue. In Kentucky, cousins who had grown up fishing the same river now carried rifles pointed in opposite directions. In Tennessee, neighbors who once shared Sunday dinners now built barricades against each other. In Missouri, entire counties fractured partisan raids and guerrilla skirmishes twisting the land into knots. Even in the White House, the war felt personal. Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, had brothers who fought for the Confederacy. 3 of them would die wearing gray. Her grief remained quiet, but it was real. In the South, men rode off to war with the songs of Dixie ringing in their ears. In the North, boys kissed their mothers goodbye at the train station's uniforms, still too big for their growing frames. They wrote letters in careful script, promising they'd be home by Christmas. But Christmas would come and go. The first great clash at Bull Run, called Manassas by the South, shattered the illusion of a quick war. Civilians had ridden out with picnic baskets to watch, thinking it might be a grand show. They left in horror, caught in the tide of retreat, as Union soldiers stumbled back through the dust and smoke. The fighting was raw, confused. Most of the soldiers were green, barely trained, barely armed. Some fought with muskets passed down from grandfathers. Others wore mismatched uniforms, unsure who was friend or foe until the smoke cleared. But when it cleared, it was always the same blood in the dirt. Wounded groaning under trees. Letters tucked into pockets that would never be delivered. And still they enlisted, driven by duty pride, fear belief. Some fought to preserve a way of life. Some to end an institution they could no longer stomach. Some just followed the sound of the crowd, the weight of their father's name, the pressure of a hometown, expecting their name on a roster. The war took them all. Not just the soldiers, but the mothers who waited at windows, the sisters who mended the coats, the children who woke to silence, where a father's footsteps used to echo. In Virginia, a Confederate soldier found his own brother's body in a Union uniform after a skirmish near a creek. He buried him quietly, tears soaking the sleeve of his coat, then returned to his post. The war did not pause for grief. In Pennsylvania, 2 friends from childhood, one north, one south, met again for a moment on a battlefield near Antietam. They did not speak, just looked at each other across the smoke, then turned away. Because by then, there was no turning back. The country had split in 2, but the hearts inside it had not. And for every shot fired, some part of America flinched inward, knowing this wasn't just a war of politics or power. It was a war of memory, of family, of blood. Brother against brother, father against son. And when it was done, whenever that might be, it would leave behind a silence deeper than any cannon's roar. Early battles and harsh lessons. War they thought would be glorious. The young men marched off in fresh uniforms, laughing, singing songs, waving to the crowds. Officers posed for portraits. Newspapers promised swift victories. Politicians in both North and South believed that their cause was just so right that surely the other side would collapse after the first real fight. But the war had other plans. Bull Run Manassas had been the first shock. Then came the others. In the spring of 1862, the war lurched westward, and the names started piling up. Shiloh. A quiet Tennessee churchyard turned into a slaughterhouse. Union General Ulysses S. Grant had camped near the Tennessee River, unaware that Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston were preparing a surprise attack. At dawn, the Confederates struck. The first hours were chaos, smoke, shouting, men scrambling to form lines. Many had never fired their weapons in anger. Trees shattered. The peach orchard in full bloom was torn to ribbons by musket fire and cannon blasts. Grant held. Reinforcements arrived. The Union counterattacked the next day, when it was over. More than 23,000 men had fallen dead, wounded, or missing. And that was just one battle. People on both sides read the numbers in disbelief. Whole towns went quiet, funerals without bodies, letters home that said only he was brave. He died quickly, even when it was not true. In Virginia, the fighting intensified. The Union launched the Peninsula Campaign, aiming to seize Richmond, the Confederate capital. General George McClellan, brilliant, cautious, and maddeningly slow, brought a massive army to the gates of the South. But he hesitated, always convinced he was outnumbered, always waiting. The Confederates did not wait. A tall, fierce general named Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia, and everything changed. Lee was bold, fast, unpredictable. He struck McClellan hard during the 7 days' battles, pushing the Union Army back down the peninsula. Richmond was saved. McClellan retreated his army, battered, his reputation shaken. Lincoln grew frustrated. He needed generals who would act, who would fight. But those were hard to find. The Union won small victories in the West, capturing forts, seizing rivers, inching into Tennessee and Mississippi. But the Eastern Theater, the land closest to Washington and Richmond, remained a bloody, tangled mess. Soldiers learned the hard way that real war was not parades and banners. It was disease, cholera, dysentery fevers that killed more than bullets. It was mud and rain, bad shoes, bad food, and worse sleep. It was screaming comrades and empty tents at dawn. It was marching through fields filled with the stench of gunpowder and death, then waking the next day to do it all again. Officers adapted. Tactics evolved. But always it came back to the same truth. This war would not end quickly. And so the factories kept grinding. The letters kept coming. The graves kept filling. America North and South was waking from its dream of glory and learning painfully slowly that the real war had only just begun. The Soldiers' War. They were boys, most of them, 17, 18. Some lied about their age to join. Others were pulled in by duty pressure or the quiet ache to be part of something larger than themselves. They came from farms, factories, fishing towns, and city streets. They arrived with rolled blankets and wide eyes, and they became soldiers. But not all at once. At first they stumbled through drills, marched in the wrong direction, fumbled with rifles. They laughed around campfires, carved their names into tree trunks, and slept 3 to a blanket when the cold came in. And then came the battles. And after that, they were never quite the same. Some men hardened. Others broke quietly. Some carried their pain like a badge. Others buried it so deep no one could see it, not even themselves. The war taught them things no books ever had. It taught them how to sleep in the rain with one eye open, how to steal food without being seen, how to tell the difference between a wound that would heal and one that wouldn't, just by the smell. They learned how to write letters that said, "I'm fine," when they weren't. How to fold a coat to hide the tear where a bullet had passed too close. How to hold a friend's hand until the shaking stopped or the breathing did. In the North, they wore blue. In the South, gray or butternut brown. But under the wool, they all bled red. They all shivered the same in snow and in fear. At night, the camps came alive with small sounds, guitars, strummed low soup boiling over a small flame, boots being patched, laughter sometimes often forced, stories passed around like bread, and in quieter corners prayers whispered into sleeves. They spoke of home constantly, of mothers and sweethearts, of horses and dogs and porches where summer wind still blew. They drew maps in the dirt of streets they'd walked 100 times, trying to remember which turn led to the old mill or which tree leaned over the fence line. Sometimes in the dark between enemy lines, soldiers called out to one another. Union and Confederate. They traded coffee for tobacco, newspapers for buttons. One night, a fiddle played in a Union camp, and a Confederate replied with a harmonica. For a moment, the war stood still, but only for a moment. Then came the bugles, the orders, the marches through mud, the long lines advancing through cornfields and over fences, hearts pounding like drums. Some units fought under flags sewn by their mothers. Others carried relics from home, a ribbon, a Bible, a locket, with a girl's name inside. They carved notches into their rifle stocks. They memorized the names of the dead. And in the moments before a charge, many whispered the same thing to themselves. Just let me see another morning. They were not just soldiers. They were sons, husbands, brothers. And though history remembers the generals, it was these men who paid the price step by step, mile by mile. They did not speak of glory, not after the first fight. They spoke of survival, of boots that fit, of hands that stopped shaking, of getting through one more day. This was their war, not the war in newspapers or in speeches, but the war in the mud, in the smoke, in the silence between volleys. And though many would never come home, they carried the weight of this country on their backs, one blistered step at a time. Women of the war. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't march in columns or fire muskets on the battlefield, but the war came for them too. At first, women were expected to stay behind, keep the home raise, the children pray for victory. But as the war grew longer, heavier, hungrier, they stepped forward. Quietly at first, then with purpose. In towns and cities, women organized rolling bandages, sewing uniforms, packing food. Churches turned into depots. Kitchens became supply stations. They held fairs to raise money, wrote letters to the lonely and the wounded, and kept whole communities stitched together by sheer determination. Some followed the armies. They washed clothes, cooked meals, and tended the sick. Others worked in field hospitals where blood soaked the floors and the air smelled of rot and lie. There, amid moans and prayers, women like Clara Barton moved from cot to cot, offering water hope and the touch of a steady hand. She became known as the angel of the battlefield. Later, she would found the American Red Cross. But in those years, she was just one woman, among many, doing what had to be done. In the South, women bore the weight of absence. With fathers, brothers, husbands gone, the burdens fell to them. They planted crops, managed slaves, ran businesses, protected homes from looters and the slow hunger of war. In Richmond, Judith McGuire, a Confederate diarist, wrote of cold nights, bread lines, and the sound of cannon fire in the distance always closer than it had been the night before. In the North, Louisa. May Alcott, before she wrote Little Women, served briefly as a nurse in Washington, recording the faces and final words of young men dying far from home. She caught fevers, cleaned wounds, and carried their last messages to families they'd never see again. And some women did more. They spied. Harriet Tubman, already a legend on the Underground Railroad, became a scout and spy for the Union Army. She guided raids, gathered intelligence, and led freedom seekers through swamps and darkness toward hope. Belle Boyd for the Confederacy used charm and cunning to pass secrets through front lines. She slipped notes in books, hid messages in dresses, and was arrested more than once, always returning to the shadows when released. Some women disguised themselves as men to fight. They bound their chests, lowered their voices, and took up rifles under false names. No one knows how many. Some were discovered. Many were not. They fought, bled, and were buried under names that never matched their birth certificates. And then there were the mothers, the sisters, the ones who waited. They watched the mail for letters. They counted candles in windows. They clutched photographs as the seasons passed, and their hope wore thin. They received telegrams that began with, "We regret to inform you." And they carried that grief for the rest of their lives. The Civil War reshaped the role of women, not overnight, not entirely, but permanently. It proved that their strength was not bound to hearth or home, that in war, as in life, they were not footnotes. They were the spine. And while the names carved into marble may mostly be men's, the stories whispered through generations, the lullabies, the letters, the quiet bravery often belonged to the women who never asked for glory, but earned it all the same. The War for Black Freedom. Long before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, there was another war already underway, a quieter one, fought in fields and cabins, in songs sung at dusk and prayers whispered after dark, a war not for land or union, but for freedom. 4 million black men, women and children lived in bondage when the Civil War began. They tilled the soil, picked the cotton, cleaned the homes, nursed the children of those who claimed to own them. Their labor built fortunes. Their suffering was the scaffolding of the Southern economy. And yet, in the official causes of war, their names were rarely spoken. At first, the North insisted the fight was only to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But the enslaved knew better. From the moment Union armies stepped into the South, people began to run. They ran through swamps, through forests, through the dead of night. They ran toward the sound of marching boots and Yankee drums, because wherever the Union flag flew, there was at least the possibility of freedom. They flooded into Union camps exhausted, barefoot, uncertain. Soldiers called them contrabands, unsure what to do, what to promise. But slowly the tide began to shift. Some black men picked up rifles. At first it was controversial. Even among Northerners, many doubted whether black men could or should serve in uniform. But they proved themselves again and again. Nowhere more clearly than at Fort Wagner in 1863. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official African-American units in the Union Army, led a near-suicidal charge on the Confederate fort. Bullets tore through the night. Bodies fell into the surf. But they did not break. Their commander, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, fell with them. He was buried in a mass grave beside his men, an insult intended by the Confederates, which became instead a lasting honor. Black soldiers fought not just for victory, but for recognition, for the right to be seen, to belong, to claim the same future they were dying to defend. By war's end, nearly 200,000 black men had served in the Union Army and Navy. Thousands more labored in support, digging trenches, building roads, nursing the wounded. Their presence transformed the war and the country. In the South, enslaved people resisted in quiet, powerful ways. They slowed their labor. They passed messages. They guided Union scouts through unfamiliar woods. They became spies, scouts, teachers, nurses, and saboteurs. And they watched to see if the promise whispered through generations, "Freedom is coming," would finally be kept. But freedom did not come all at once, and it did not come without resistance. Even in the North, racism held firm. Black soldiers were often paid less, given inferior weapons, assigned the most dangerous duties, and when they fell in battle, some were buried without names, without honors. But they kept fighting. Because for them, the war was not about restoring a union. It was about building a new one in which a child born in chains might grow up free, one in which skin color would not define one's worth or one's fate, one in which liberty and justice for all meant all. Their war was older than 1861 and longer than Appomattox, but it was real, and it mattered. And its legacy is still with us in every name written in the margins, in every stone laid where history once tried to forget them. This was the war within the war, and it was fought with courage, conviction, and an unshakable hope that freedom was not just a word in a document. It was a life, and they intended to live it. Antietam and Emancipation. The sun rose on September 17, 1862, over quiet fields near Sharpsburg, Maryland, fields lined with corn fences and fog. By nightfall, they would be soaked with the blood of nearly 23,000 Americans. Antietam, the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. Union General George McClellan had finally moved against Robert E. Lee, whose Army of Northern Virginia had crossed the Potomac into Union territory. Lee hoped a bold strike into the North would turn the tide, win foreign recognition, perhaps even peace on Confederate terms. But McClellan held something rare, a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around cigars and left behind by mistake. He knew what was coming, and still the day would be chaos. At dawn, Union troops slammed into Confederate lines near a small church, a whitewashed structure called the Dunker Church. The cornfield nearby was torn apart, stalks flattened under fire so heavy that soldiers said it sounded like 100 thunders crashing at once. Wave after wave, the lines surged and fell. Regiments were cut down in minutes. Whole companies disappeared in smoke and shrapnel. Midday came, and with it, Bloody Lane, a sunken road where Confederate troops took position only to be pinned in place by a brutal, withering assault. By the time Union forces overran it, the lane was filled shoulder to shoulder with the dead. Then came the final clash at Burnside's Bridge, where Southern sharpshooters held off wave after wave from the high ground. It took hours and hundreds of lives before the Union Army finally pushed across. When it ended, neither side could claim true victory. But Lee retreated, and Lincoln saw his opening. He had waited for a Union success, not necessarily a triumph, but something solid, to issue the order he had carried in his coat pocket for weeks. He had written it in private, refined it in silence, and now at last, it was time. The Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced that as of the new year, all enslaved people in rebellious states would be, thenceforward, and forever free. It did not free everyone, not the enslaved in loyal border states, not those in already occupied Confederate regions, but it transformed the war. It made it a fight not just to preserve the Union, but to end slavery. It closed the door on compromise. It ensured that foreign powers, especially Britain and France, would not come to the aid of the Confederacy. And it sent a signal to every enslaved person who had listened through whispered hopes. The president now fought for their freedom too. Some criticized him, said it was political, said it was too little too late. But the proclamation was a moral cannon blast. It gave the war a second front one of conscience, and it allowed black men for the first time officially to enlist in the Union Army and fight for their own liberation. Lincoln later said, "If my name ever goes into history, it'll be for this act." He did not say it lightly, because he knew what it cost. He knew that emancipation would harden the war, sharpen the resistance, lengthen the struggle. But he signed it anyway, with a steady hand, and across the South word began to spread from plantation to quarters to forest trail. Not just a rumor this time, a declaration. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It had a date, it had a voice, and it had begun. Gettysburg. The road to Gettysburg was not paved with destiny, it was stumbled upon. In June 1863, General Robert E. Lee once again led his Army of Northern Virginia north into Union territory. He hoped a victory on Northern soil would shake the Union's resolve, turn public opinion, perhaps even force a negotiated peace. His army was riding high after victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Morale was strong, supplies were low, the gamble was bold. They moved into Pennsylvania, quiet farms, winding roads, stone fences, hills, rolling like waves, and there by chance, they ran into the Union Army near a crossroads town called Gettysburg. The collision began on July 1st. Skirmishers met northwest of town. Soon, both sides began pouring in troops. Union forces were pushed back through the streets, retreating to a ridge south of town, Cemetery Hill. That night, under a darkening sky, more Union troops arrived. The high ground was theirs, and they would not give it up. July 2nd brought the full fury of battle. Lee attacked the Union flanks at Little Round Top Union. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his 20th Maine held off wave after wave of Confederate assaults, eventually charging downhill with bayonets when their ammunition ran dry. They held. Across the battlefield, places like the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den were transformed into slaughterhouses. The fighting was savage, up close, desperate. Commanders fell. Regiments vanished. But the Union lines held. July 3rd. Lee tried one last gamble. He ordered a massive frontal assault on the Union center at Cemetery Ridge. It would be remembered as Pickett's charge. 12th, 500 Confederate soldiers, crossing open fields for nearly a mile under relentless Union cannon and rifle fire. They were cut down in rows. Few reached the stone wall at the crest. Those who did were quickly repelled. The charge had failed. The gamble was lost. Lee rode out to meet the survivors, his voice soft. "It is all my fault." The next day, he began the retreat back to Virginia. The Confederate invasion of the North had ended. More than 50,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing after those 3 days. The town of Gettysburg would never forget the sound, the smell, the silence that followed. And months later, President Lincoln came to speak at the dedication of the cemetery. His remarks were short, just a few minutes, barely 270 words. But in those words he reshaped the meaning of the war. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war had begun to save the Union. At Gettysburg and in Lincoln's speech, it became something more, a struggle, to define what the Union meant. Freedom, equality, a second founding paid in blood. The cannons fell silent. The soldiers buried their dead. But the echoes of Gettysburg would never quite fade. They still haven't. The home front. Not all battles were fought with rifles. Some were fought with empty cupboards, quiet prayers, and the slow ticking of clocks in houses that waited. While armies marched and cannons thundered across states, life continued behind the lines, changed, strained, and shadowed by war. This was the home front, where courage looked different, not a charge into fire, but endurance across years. In the South, the war reached every doorstep. With so many men at the front, farms and plantations were left in the hands of women, children, and the elderly. Tools broke, livestock died, rail lines were torn up or captured. Union blockades cut off supplies from overseas, leaving store shelves bare and stomachs empty. Salt was scarce. Coffee became a memory. Families ground acorns to make a bitter brew, sewed clothing from curtains, bartered for candles and soap. Paper money printed by the Confederacy lost its value until it was little more than decoration. Inflation soared. People paid hundreds of dollars for a sack of flour. Hunger turned into unrest. In Richmond, The Confederate Capitol women stormed bakeries in what became known as the bread riots. They carried clubs and shouted for food. These were not lawless mobs. They were mothers, sisters, wives, desperate, tired, angry. And still, they endured. In the North, life was better, but not untouched. Prices rose, taxes climbed. Factories once built for textiles and tools now turned out rifles, cannons, and uniforms. Women stepped into jobs once held by men, running shops, staffing offices, welding, sewing, and soldering. The industrial power of the Union turned war into economy. Cities boomed, railroads expanded, and yet not all were happy. Some Northerners resented the draft, especially the poor who couldn't afford to pay for substitutes. In New York City, when conscription began, frustration exploded into violence. The draft riots of 1863 turned the streets into chaos. Immigrant laborers attacking black citizens, burning homes, and lynching men simply for the color of their skin. The war exposed divisions, not just between North and South, but within. Still, the letters never stopped. Paper folded with trembling hands, ink blurred by tears, carried for miles through mud and danger to reach a tent or a trench, each word a lifeline. Dear husband, the baby took her first steps. Dear Mama, tell Papa I miss him. Tell the boys the corn's come in. Come home. Just come home. In both North and South, church bells rang for the fallen and black crepe hung from porch railings. Towns held funerals with no bodies, only uniforms folded in silence. And some waited for years, long after the guns fell quiet, because no one had ever told them for certain. They only knew the waiting had become part of life. Through it all, the people behind the lines bore the weight of the war in 1,000 invisible ways. They lit candles in windows. They fed neighbors when there was nothing left. They buried hopes beside gardens. And they sang lullabies to children who would never remember their fathers. This was not the war of generals and grand strategy. It was the war of firewood and flour, of whispered names and chairs left empty. It was the war of those who stayed. And in many ways, it was they who kept the country from falling apart completely. They who reminded the men, when they came home, broken and quiet, why they had fought at all. Lincoln, the leader. He wasn't what people expected in a president. Too tall, too thin, clothes that never seemed to fit right, a voice more prairie than polished. And yet, when the country began to fracture, it was Abraham Lincoln, quiet, deliberate, often sorrowful, who stepped into the fire. He didn't seek glory. He carried burden. When he took office in 1861, the nation was already unraveling. Southern states had left the Union. His own election had sparked secession. He walked into the White House not as a savior, but as a question: could anyone hold this together? At first, many doubted him. He had no military background, no upper-class education. His cabinet was filled with rivals, men who had mocked him, outshone him, and expected him to fail. But Lincoln had something else: clarity, patience, a fierce, quiet understanding of the stakes. He studied maps late into the night. He read every letter that mattered. He visited soldiers in hospitals, held their hands, listened to their stories. He wept with mothers and buried his own son in the middle of the war. And above all, he stayed steady. Through every defeat, Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, through every general who hesitated, disappointed, or walked away, through the pressure to compromise, to sue for peace, to let the Union fracture just enough to make the fighting stop. He never did. He believed the Union must endure not just as a government, but as an idea. And over time, the country began to see the steel beneath the sorrow. He removed generals when he had to. He challenged his own party when they drifted from principle. He waited for the right moment to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, knowing it would change the war and him forever. And he evolved. The man who once spoke cautiously of slavery became its fiercest political opponent. He learned from the blood, the loss, the cries of widows and soldiers and enslaved people who risked everything for freedom. He let that change him. By 1863, he had grown into something larger than the office he held, not through speeches or victories, but through endurance, through pain. And in that year, on a cold November afternoon, he stood on a field in Gettysburg and gave not just a speech, but a mirror to the nation's soul, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. It wasn't about preserving what was. It was about becoming what could be. Lincoln carried the war not just on paper, but in his bones. His face aged 10 years in half that time. Photographs show the toll eyes, heavier lines, deeper posture, slightly more bent each season. And yet, he never wavered. He listened. He wrestled with decisions that no man should have to make. And he walked each day toward the end of a war he had never wanted, but knew he had to finish. When people met him, they expected something grand. What they found instead was a man of long silences and deep thought. And somehow that was enough. Because in a war full of noise, Lincoln gave the country something rare: a quiet strength, a moral center, a belief that even amid ruin a nation could still find its way home. Not perfect, but possible. He would not live to see what came after. But by then, he had already become what the moment needed, not just a president, but the soul of a fractured nation, holding its pieces with both hands. Sherman's March. By late 1864, the war had dragged on for nearly 4 years. The country was tired of death, of speeches, of promises that peace was near. But in the West, a new kind of war was coming, one that would not simply defeat armies. It would shatter the very foundation the South stood upon, and it would come with fire. General William Tecumseh Sherman, a man of fierce logic and little patience for sentiment, believed that to end the war, the Confederacy had to be broken, not just on the battlefield, but at its heart, its economy, its spirit, its will. So, he set out to do exactly that. In the fall of 1864, after capturing Atlanta, Sherman began a march to the sea, a scorched path from Georgia to Savannah. He left his supply lines behind. No base, no retreat. Just 60,000 men and an iron will. They marched through farms and fields, tearing up railroads, burning cotton, twisting iron tracks into snarled Sherman's neckties around trees. They did not fight major battles. They simply moved unstoppable and left silence behind. Houses were emptied, barns torched, mules and cattle taken, plantations stripped of their wealth, their order, their myth of permanence. Slavery collapsed in their wake. Enslaved people flocked to the columns, tens of thousands following the blue coats toward freedom. They walked with bare feet, carried children on their backs, sang as they marched. Some found shelter, others suffered hunger, cold and heartbreak. But still they came. Sherman's men called them contrabands, but the truth was simpler. They were walking out of bondage and into history. The march was brutal, but deliberate. Sherman wrote, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." He believed mercy toward systems of oppression only prolonged the suffering. He aimed to end the war by making it impossible for the South to continue it. By December, he reached Savannah, presenting the city to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. not long after he turned north into South Carolina, the state that had first seceded. And there the fires burned even hotter. To many in the North, Sherman was a hero. To many in the South, he became a name spoken with dread. But no one doubted his effectiveness. He had waged a new kind of war, total war, not aimed at soldiers alone, but at the very machinery of rebellion. And with every mile he marched, the end came closer. Behind him the land smoldered. Ahead, the Union tightened its grip, and above it all the nation, ragged, weary, half-hopeful, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this war might finally have an end. Appomattox. By the spring of 1865, the war was gasping. Confederate armies were scattered, exhausted. Railroads had splintered. Horses were starving. Food was scarce. Hope even scarcer. In Virginia, General Robert E. Lee still held command, but his army, once proud, once seemingly invincible, was now threadbare. They fought not for victory anymore, but for survival. And even that was slipping away. Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant had pressed relentlessly through the winter, hammering at Confederate defenses outside Petersburg, south of Richmond. The siege had dragged for months. Trenches, mud, hunger, rain. Day after day, the Union inched forward. Night after night, the South bled. And then, on April 2nd, 1865, Lee's line broke. Grant's troops poured through. Petersburg fell. Richmond burned as Confederate officials fled. President Jefferson Davis escaped by train, but the capital of the Confederacy was no more. Lee's only option was retreat. He moved west, hoping to join with remaining Confederate forces in North Carolina. But the Union was faster. They blocked roads, cut supply lines, surrounded his army with silent precision. The end was no longer a question, only a matter of days. And so on April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee, dressed in his finest uniform, rode through the Virginia countryside to the small village of Appomattox Courthouse, where Ulysses S. Grant was waiting. They met in the parlor of a brick house owned by Wilmer McLean, a man who had fled the war years earlier, only for it to find him again at the end. The meeting was quiet, respectful. Two generals, two men, both tired, both steady. Grant arrived dusty in a crumpled coat. He offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would surrender their arms, return home, and so long as they laid down their weapons, be left in peace. Officers could keep their horses and sidearms. No trials, no vengeance. Lee agreed. When he left the house, he mounted his horse, and his men watched in silence. Some wept, others simply bowed their heads. There was no cheering from the Union side, no jeers, only stillness. Because everyone understood this was not just a victory, it was a funeral. For hundreds of thousands who would never come home. For a nation that would never be quite the same again. 5 days later, Lincoln would walk through the smoldering streets of Richmond, quiet, thoughtful. Soldiers and freed people lined the roads to see him pass. One man shouted, "Glory, hallelujah," but joy was fleeting. For on April 14th, just days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was shot while sitting in Ford's Theater. He died the next morning. The president who had held the country together did not live to see it start again. And yet in that quiet room in Virginia, when Grant and Lee signed their names and shook hands, something extraordinary happened. The war ended with dignity, not with revenge, not with executions or spectacle, but with paper, with terms, with a handshake between enemies who chose at last to stop the bleeding. The guns were falling silent, and the rebuilding, long, painful, uncertain, was about to begin. The long road of Reconstruction. The war was over. The flags had been lowered, the guns stacked in silence, the bodies buried in fields that once grew wheat and corn. But peace was something else entirely. Because the moment the last shot was fired, a harder question emerged. What now? The United States, so nearly broken, had to become one country again. But not the same country. It could never go back to what it was before. It had to be rebuilt, reshaped, reimagined. This chapter would be called Reconstruction, and it would test the nation in ways the battlefield never could. At the heart of it was a new undeniable fact. 4 million people were now free. No more auction blocks, no more chains, no more papers declaring ownership. But freedom declared is not freedom delivered. Where would they go? What land would they work? What justice would protect them? What future would welcome them? The Freedmen's Bureau was created, a government agency tasked with helping formerly enslaved people transition into a life of liberty. It provided food, built schools, reunited families, and helped negotiate labor contracts. But the challenges were overwhelming. Resources were scarce. Opposition ran deep. And in the South, old power structures did not disappear. They simply adapted. Many former Confederates returned to their homes and reclaimed their land. Though the war had been lost, their beliefs had not changed. New laws, black codes, were quickly passed, aiming to control and restrict the movement, labor, and rights of black Americans. In Washington, there was tension. Some leaders wanted leniency, especially President Andrew Johnson, who had taken office after Lincoln's assassination. Johnson was a Southerner by birth, and while he claimed loyalty to the Union, he showed little interest in true equality. Others in Congress, called radical Republicans, pushed back. They wanted deeper change: voting rights, civil rights, real protection under the law. The battle shifted from fields to chambers. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery. The 14th granted citizenship to anyone born in the United States. The 15th gave black men the right to vote. On paper, a new nation was forming, one based on equal rights. But paper only holds what people are willing to uphold. In many parts of the South, resistance turned violent. The Ku Klux Klan rose from the ashes of defeat, cloaked in white hoods and terror. They burned homes, threatened voters, lynched men whose only crime was seeking the rights they'd been promised. Black communities stood firm. They built churches, opened schools, started businesses. They ran for office. Hundreds of black men were elected to local, state, and even federal positions during Reconstruction. Some walked the halls of Congress, their voices echoing through marble corridors once closed to them. It was a fragile, flickering moment of possibility. But by the late 1870s, the tide was turning again. A political deal, the Compromise of 1877, removed the last federal troops from the South, and with them went the protection Reconstruction had offered. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing segregation and stripping away voting rights through poll taxes, literacy tests, and pure intimidation. The hope of Reconstruction dimmed, and yet its legacy remained. Because for a moment, however brief, the United States had tried to become a nation truer to its ideals. It had stumbled. It had failed in many ways. But it had also planted seeds of dignity, of equality, of a dream still unfinished. The war had ended, but the struggle to define freedom, to live up to the promise carved into the Declaration of Independence, was far from over. And for millions, that struggle would last, not just years, but generations. A nation reforged. In the years after the war, America felt like a cracked bell still ringing, but never quite the same. The land was scorched, the people bruised, the questions unhealed. But there was motion again. The Union had held, but now it had to become something greater. Not just a country that survived, but one that could begin again. Across the North, factories that once made rifles now churned out steel and locomotives. Cities grew taller, railroads stretched farther. There was a hum of ambition in the air. Businessmen spoke of industry, of markets, of progress. In the South, things moved differently, slowly, painfully. Plantations lay in ruins. The enslaved were free, but landless. Some stayed and became sharecroppers working the same soil, but now under contracts and debts that bound them in new, quieter ways. Others left following rail lines, chasing a whisper of something better. The war had ended one system, but not all chains, and yet there were flickers of something new. Public schools began to appear across the South, often for the first time. Newspapers written by and for Black Americans told stories long ignored. Churches, once places of refuge, became centers of political life, education, and community. There was rebuilding, not just of roads and buildings, but of the American identity itself. The country amended its Constitution 3 times in 5 years. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th granted equal protection under the law. The 15th protected voting rights for Black men. It was as if the founding ideals, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, had been rewritten with fire and blood. And now the question was whether the nation would live up to them. But not everyone was ready. White supremacist violence surged in the South. Poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation at the ballot box, laws that separated water fountains, schools, train cars, cemeteries. The battle had shifted from muskets to mandates, but the fight for equality had only changed shape. Still, some refused to yield. Black Americans organized, voted, built businesses, wrote poetry. They formed fraternal orders, published newspapers, filed lawsuits, raised families. They believed in this country even when it did not believe in them. Meanwhile, new questions pressed in from the West. What about the native nations, whose lands were being swallowed by railroads and settlers? What of the immigrants arriving in waves? Irish, German, Chinese building tracks and cities, but rarely finding welcome. What of women who had marched for abolition, served as nurses, kept the farms and shops while men were at war, and now asked, what about us? The war had shaken the foundation, but it had also widened the stage. More voices, more demands, more dreams. Lincoln had called it a new birth of freedom. But birth is painful, messy, uncertain, and yet there it was, a country not yet healed, but still reaching. Not yet just, but still trying. The stars on the flag were stitched back together. The dead were buried but remembered. And a battered, sprawling, restless nation stood on its feet, scarred, yes, but still standing. The Civil War had answered one terrible question. Could a nation built on contradiction, freedom and slavery, union and rebellion, survive? The answer was yes. But the next question was harder. Could it become what it was meant to be? That answer would take more than a war. It would take a century, and the work of every soul who still believed the story was worth telling. Memory and myth. The cannons had long gone silent, but the war never truly left. Not from the land, not from the people, and not from the stories they told themselves after. Because what followed the Civil War wasn't just rebuilding railroads or courthouses. It was the slow, stubborn shaping of memory, what to remember, what to forget, and what to pretend never happened at all. In the South, mourning turned into mythology. Confederate veterans returned to towns that barely recognized them. Their uniforms were worn thin. Their cause defeated their families, changed by absence and grief. Some took to rebuilding. Others turned to legacy, Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy began erecting statues, writing textbooks, shaping a version of the war that softened its edges. In town, squares, and courthouse lawns, marble soldiers appeared, not in defeat, but standing proud eyes fixed on some distant past that never truly was. It became known as the Lost Cause, a story told over porches and pulpits in which the South hadn't fought for slavery, but for honor heritage states' rights. Slavery in this version was barely mentioned, or worse, portrayed as benign. But for millions of Black Americans there was no myth, only memory, of chains broken but freedom unfinished, of promises written into law, then erased at the polls, of schoolhouses burned, of churches bombed, of a new world that looked in many ways too much like the old one. And yet they remembered truth. They passed it on in songs and sermons, in Sunday dinner stories and fading photographs. They told of ancestors who fought for the Union, who taught their children to read by lamplight, who built lives from the ashes of cotton fields. Up north, remembrance took a different shape. Memorial Day was born, first called Decoration Day, as a way to honor the Union dead. Soldiers' graves were trimmed with flowers, their names read aloud beneath waving flags. Speeches praised sacrifice, unity, the preservation of the nation. But even in the North, the war's meaning was not always simple. As decades passed, a desire for national healing sometimes meant overlooking the cause of the conflict. Reunions of old soldiers focused on shared suffering, not on why they fought. A handshake between blue and gray was celebrated, but too often the struggle of Black Americans was left out of frame. History became quieter, more comfortable, but never complete. Some remembered the war as glory, others as tragedy. Still others, especially those whose ancestors had no say in it, remembered it as unfinished work. Walt Whitman, who had tended to wounded soldiers in Washington hospitals, once wrote, "The real war will never get in the books." He was right in a way, because the real war lived in shadows and scars, in the whispered prayers of mothers, in the echo of a drum down a dirt road, in the space between what was promised and what was delivered. And yet the story endured, carved into stone, etched into song, passed on generation to generation, not just as history, but as a question that still hangs in the air. What does it mean to be one nation, not in word, not in myth, but in truth? The Civil War left behind more than graves. It left behind a mirror. And every so often this country still stands before it trying to recognize itself. Echoes through the years. The smoke had cleared, the soldiers returned, or didn't, and yet the war never really ended. It echoed, in schoolbooks and sermons, in courtrooms and campaign speeches, in the quiet tension between neighbors. The Civil War was not just a memory, it was a current beneath the surface of American life, shaping the river, even when the water looked calm. Its questions still hung in the air. Could liberty truly be equal for all? Could justice be blind to skin? Could a country that once tore itself in two be trusted to hold together? Each generation wrestled with these questions in its own way. In the early 1900s, Jim Crow laws deepened. Segregation was not only accepted, it was enforced by law and by violence. The promises of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, written in ink after the war, were left to gather dust in court files and shattered ballots. And yet people kept pushing. W.E.B. Du Bois, the grandson of a Union soldier, called for civil rights and higher education. Ida B. Wells documented lynchings and spoke truths no one wanted printed. Booker T. Washington built schools with brick and willpower. They fought with ideas, with ink, with hope. And decades later, in the 1950s and 60s, Those echoes became a movement. Rosa Parks sat down. Martin Luther King Jr. stood up. Marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge while cameras rolled and the country watched. They did not carry muskets, but they walked in the footsteps of those who had. Their struggle was not new. It was the unfinished business of 1865, and the flag they carried, red, white, and blue, was claimed again, not just as a symbol of the Union that had survived, but of the nation that could still become better. The Civil War lived in those marches, in the songs sung in jails, in the court decisions and resistance and long-awaited change. Even now it lingers, in statues debated, in flags waved or lowered, in textbooks rewritten, in the questions people ask about identity, power, justice, truth. The war gave America a second birth, but it did not come with instructions. And so the country has continued to wrestle with what it means to be united. Not just by borders or laws or economy, but by a shared belief that we are each other's. Some still argue about who the heroes were. Some still deny what the war was really about. Some still want to forget. But the past doesn't vanish. It settles in names carved on courthouses, in the shape of our politics, in the quiet gaps between people who still carry the weight of history in different ways. And so the echoes continue, not to haunt, but to remind that freedom is not won once it is defended, redefined, lived. Every generation hears the echo in its own voice, and the choice always is whether to listen or to begin again. Good night, America. And so the story comes to rest, not with fireworks, not with fanfare, but with a breath. The Civil War ended more than 150 years ago. The soldiers are long gone. Their letters have yellowed, their uniforms faded, their graves weathered by rain and time. But the echoes remain not loud now, but steady like a heartbeat beneath the soil. It is easy to think of history as something distant, something done. But the truth is, we live with it every day. It shapes our streets and schools. It lingers in our silences. It looks back at us from bronze statues and photographs and the quiet space between headlines. The Civil War was not just a conflict of maps and muskets. It was a reckoning with who we were, with who we wanted to be. It tore this country open, and it gave us a second chance to believe again in liberty, to try again at justice, to carry the promises of our founding not just in words, but in deeds. We have not always done it well. We still fall short. But every generation has picked up the thread in its own way, marching, writing, teaching, voting, dreaming. And so tonight, as you rest, let yourself drift back to the hush of a winter campfire at Valley Forge, to the rustle of a letter being read aloud in a cabin, to the creak of a church pew in a freedman's school, to the final echo of boots marching home. Because this story is yours too, not just theirs, not just the North or the South, but America's, made by ordinary people, sewn together by courage and contradiction, held together by a stubborn, quiet hope that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And now, close your eyes. Let the past settle into stillness. Let the stars watch over you like they watched over those soldiers long ago. Good night, America. You've come a long way, and the story isn't over yet.